first time I ever saw VR was actually in 1999. My husband was, at the time, Bill Gates' technical advisor, and he created a VR piece where I was a molecule going through a turbine, and depending on how the turbine moved, it changed the efficiency. And the thing was very clunky. It was like an old 1960s hairdryer. And many, many years later, I was able to do a virtual walkthrough of my house that had been torn down. I had a virtual recreation that a friend of mine made, actually, as sad as this is, of my husband who had passed away. And I realized there's so much about the technology that's going to affect every part of our daily lives, whether it's medicine or entertainment or government. In fact, the first time I was in this hall, I was speaking on a panel at the Dubai Film Festival when we were working on VR for movies and television and doing things like the VR walk up Mount Everest. Today, I think it's not an issue of whether VR, AR are going to become useful tools. It's a matter of how do they become the most useful, the most efficient, how do we make them cost effective, and how do we make them safe and secure for society? Because it's not just a matter of creating a VR game, it's a matter of that technology can change everything about how our brain works, it can change everything about our government tools and infrastructure and laws. So that's a long answer to your question, but it'll give you a little bit of information to start with.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Actually, I want to know your opinion about it, Mr. Seth. Can you identify some AR, VR developments that are taking us by surprise? But I want also to focus with you the integration of AI with these technologies, AR, VR in general, how it will impact not only the design or the usability, but also in terms of content.
AI with them?
Yes.
Okay, so when you combine artificial intelligence and VR, or AR, it's all spatial computing. It's magical, right? I can put you in a world right now. You can come to our office, and you can talk to a non-human, and for all intents and purposes, you believe that's a human. But what it's also allowing us to do is make experiences that are better. So, for instance, my partners are Disney and Amazon and MGM. So if you look at our Creed game, so we're finding a lot of different things. But when you combine AI, it allows you to have a level of communication with these characters that aren't human, but it also allows you to create experiences that you just couldn't create before. So for instance, one of the games we have is Aliens, based on the movie. And we're able to move these xenomorphs, these aliens that are hunting you, in much more efficient patterns because they have all these rules. And when you look at all these devices, every device that you use, whether it's in your pocket or it's on your desktop, it has a central processing unit called a CPU and a graphics processing unit called a GPU. And what this allows us to do is take the bandwidth and parallel process different streams from each of these processors, and we can do it offline. And so when you put it together, it makes it much more efficient. For the user, it makes a much better experience. Another example is boxing. We do a lot of boxing games. And so we can take all of your kinematics. You throw a jab, and we can look at the jab as it's thrown and you throw it, and you can say, I want to have a fighting style that's like Mike Tyson. And so we can make your jab look more like Mike Tyson's and make it better compared to how you perform. Or we can look at it as tens of millions of people do the same jab and make your jab better according to all those people. So we can do both, and it's the AI that allows us to do it because it processes it so quickly. So those experiences that were clunky 3 years ago, 5 years ago, they now seem just real when you get in it.
What do you think, Lauren, about this, and what challenges and opportunities this integration and combination makes, in your opinion, especially in the matters of user engagement?
So, first of all, I'm finding it much, much easier to make the kind of content that I want to make. To give a perfect example, many years ago we made a movie called Lone Survivor, and there was a scene in it where a man goes falling down a hillside very rapidly. And we did it in one take, which was quite frankly, really stupid, and he broke a bunch of ribs in the process of it. But that would have taken many, many days to shoot that. Now I can literally speak into my computer, and it can iterate out not just images of what I'm saying. It can create an entire storyboard, and now it can create an entire movie. And that's just by me speaking. And then once it learns my preferences or the preferences of the tool set, then I'll be able to tell you a story right here, and then behind me as I'm telling it, it'll show the story in whatever either I want it to look like, maybe it's a cartoon, or maybe what you want it to look like because maybe you like old black and white movies. So the tools that exist out there, I think the issues are going to be there's too much choice. I think the problems are going to be that there isn't enough compute power. And I think that the figuring out who owns the rights at the end of the day, the lawyers are going to have a field day on it, trying to figure out the kernel of the initial piece of content, how it streams out from there, and who owns the different pieces of it, and the waterfall of who makes the money off of that is going to be complicated. But I always think that those things that are complicated are the areas that are the most exciting and the places that I like to play in, and I know Seth does too.
We've seen some cases before.
Well, right now, I think in terms of the AI development combined with VR, most of it's very new. And I think the biggest issue you'll find really, there are three. There's speed, there's cost, and there's scale. So right now, for instance, if I want to work on certain platforms, I have to take what I'm doing in VR. We use an engine called Epic's Unreal Engine. And I have to take that data and I have to send it up to a server, which is 70 milliseconds. And then I have to process that data, and then I have to send it back down for 70 milliseconds, and then I have to give you facial animation and everything else so you can't distinguish the difference between a human and a non-human. That's too long, that's an eternity. So what we need is the ability to do that at what's called the edge, right? So right at the edge, so it's processing on the device. So there's sort of two pieces of VR right now. There's the systems which are server dependent, which make a lot of sense if you're, working in, healthcare, government, military. But for entertainment and gaming, where it's twitch, very fast reactions, we need something that's literally in your pocket. So most of the devices that you have in your hands now have some sort of neural processing unit. And when you combine the neural processing units with the ability to do something that is right on the edge, now we don't have the milliseconds up. So we solve the speed problem. The second issue is for games. We make big games that sell on PlayStation, PC, etc. So if you want to sell those big games, you're selling those for, let's say, $80 to a customer. You can't have an open-ended cost stream where you have to process something on a server, or everybody's going to go bankrupt if your game's popular. So from a cost perspective, you need it to be able to be what's called a local LLM, or a local large language model, which would be on your device. And then the last piece is scale, to what Lauren was just saying before. So if I have 1 million users jump in a day on something that's server side, it's going to crash. It's not going to work. So we need the ability for those to work at the actual edge. So that's a lot of what we're working on now for the next generations of products that you'll start to see coming out in 26, 27, and 28.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you very much. But I want also to talk about the societal consequences, of course, and side effects. Lauren, these technologies are relatively new and forever evolving. And also regulatory bodies in each country are trying to keep with the pace with these advancements and rapid advancements with the tools, in these tools. What is the appropriate, in your point of view, of governments and regulatory bodies that should be to protect people and users, but at the same time not to block the innovation and the progress in the creativity?
So I'll go backwards in time on this one a little bit because I want to catch you up to speed. But in 2000, I worked for a company that did background music. And at the time, we just won the Starbucks contract. So we had to figure out, my job was to, how do we become legal in 30 countries in 90 days with all the music in the entire portfolio. It was very manual. I would pick up the phone in the morning, depending on the time zone. I'd have a conversation with whoever was handling the legal side of their country and their industry to figure out, was that song okay? Could it have been, do we have to remove it because of certain religious reasons or cultural reasons or whatever the reason was? Very, very manual. Those things are no longer manual anymore, but because it's iterating and happening so fast on a persistent level within gaming, it's very hard to keep up in a regulatory manner. So to get you up to speed to where some of the things are that we do right now, we have investments in many different companies, including in Seth's company. But for the purpose of this conversation, there's a gaming company called Build a Rocket Boy, which was started by Leslie Benzies, who made Grand Theft Auto. That game comes out this year. He has made more money in one game in Grand Theft Auto than the top 5 directors combined over their lifetime. And it's because the scale is massive. And so there's no room for a mistake. If you're playing a video game and it gets glitchy, you're just not going to play it anymore. It doesn't attract you anymore, and you don't come back for seconds. So you have to make it very fast, very user-friendly, and because of that, in each country, it has to be, has to already pre-qualified through the loops that it has to go through on the government regulatory issues. And I don't think governments have figured out yet what their laws should be, which is why there's so much controversy about gaming and AI and age categories of who can play what, and what you can wear in the game if you're an avatar. It's very unusual. What you can touch, not touch. Those are all conversations that we have on a daily basis, and are continuing. We will be continuing to have them as governments shift and change their own regulatory bodies to satisfy what their populations need and what their cultures are looking for. Same thing with education, by the way. Education and AI. Very interesting.
But what do you suggest to get this balance?
I suggest these kind of conversations. I really do. I suggest that, it's actually kind of funny because at one point I thought, well, why don't we just ask AI to come up with its own regulation? But then that becomes a fear factor too. You can't really place that responsibility onto AI when you want to, but you can't. So I think what it really requires is a little bit of patience, some very thoughtful people within each government regulatory body, and then working together to make sure that we have a sort of a unified system across the board and in what's possible, because we do need these kind of technological advances. And also just a little patience, I think. Don't say no to everything too fast just because it doesn't sit right with you. It's just, maybe this has just not been tweaked enough yet. And I think that's...
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Seth? What kinds of policies are necessary to govern these technologies?
So I always like to break things down for what are we solving for. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to this, we're solving for 2 things. The first is humans. If you go out, forget games for a second, just look at an article that someone writes. Mm-hmm. Do you ever, when you look at the comments, do you ever see anything positive, right? You see a lot of anger.
Yeah.
And a lot of negative, but people don't take the time to write something positive. So now you've got a bias. That's an issue. So when you put humans in games or any sort of media, what we tend to find is there's sort of, 1% that's putting out commentary that speaks for what you would think is 100%, and it's typically very negative, and there's a huge bias to it. The second thing is the data side, garbage in, garbage out, right? So it all depends on the data sets we have to train models with, right? So if we have the right parameters and the right data, we're able to train models. So going back to what I was saying before, when you're looking at speed, cost, and scale, for what I do in games, it's pretty easy. I can take something like the Aliens movies, or I can take the Creed and Rocky films, and I've got a lot of content that I can go train a model with. That is very easy. And I can also do that on, let's say, a 7 billion parameter model that I can put in your pocket. So that can then talk to your television, your PlayStation, your PC, whatever you want. That is super easy to do. And that's something where, from a government perspective, that's easy, right? We've got a model, we have a certain amount of parameters, and we understand a lot of what outcomes are going to look like. Then you have what you're looking at, which is more AGI. That's a much bigger model, and now when you look at the inputs that are coming from the internet, that's where you start to have to get careful, right? And you start to have to understand. And to what Lauren was saying, that affects everything from education to entertainment, and that gets a lot more difficult. So I really think it depends on what you're trying to regulate. And when you look at certain countries right now, I mean, we sell games in 60+ markets, right? Certain markets like PRC in China, right? They have very stringent rules around what content can go into the market and then how that gets regulated. So we have a partner and we have a joint venture there. So when we put content in there, we know that we're doing it in the right way. A lot of companies, the answer is we're just going to throw the content in and see what happens. So I think you have to work with the government. You have to understand what the rules and regulations are to be able to put your content in and do it in a way that's appropriate, right? And then and following the rules. And then the second piece is, from an AI perspective, it's really in the data sets, because what you want is you want to have data that makes sense, and it makes sense for the content. It makes sense for who's using that content, because there's a huge difference between a 10-year-old kid and a 65-year-old male. Right, so you want to make sure that you've got the appropriate content going to the right person, and that the input for that content's correct off the beginning.
But we don't have the same regulations in all the countries. Each country has its own regulations, so it affects.
It does, but if our data is correct going in, our output is correct coming out, because at the end of the day, it's just running a process. So it's really making sure that those data sets that is your input, that they're following the rules for whatever that particular geo is.
It's probably no different than the old school way of giving a rating to a movie, right? Different countries had different ratings. Some scenes had to be removed. Some scenes you could keep in. Some movies couldn't even be played. But then government bodies are, they're living, breathing entities. They're not static and immovable. And so what may have not been able to be seen in one place might be able to be seen today. So that, patience and flexibility and the movement of how a government regulatory body can change things is also entirely possible.
Yeah, and look, to what Lauren's saying, we've got a game which is Puzzle Bobble by Square Enix. It's family friendly. It's something that children play with their mothers. We've got music games which are the same way, and then we've got games where people burn, they'll burn. We've burned 1 billion calories in Creed, right? The game actually makes you healthier.
But we've seen excuse me for this, but we've seen like Vision Pro, and people are going like ghosts in the streets. So there's like this mix between the reality, virtual and physical realities in people. How to make sure that we shift the trajectory and development positively?
So look at our boxing game, right? People have burned 1 billion calories. People who play our game, we built it as a game, and we learned it was a fitness experience. People will spend 48 minutes on average playing that game. The average person only exercises 29 minutes. And if you look at that and assuming that the average lifespan is 76 years old, you're adding 4.5 years to someone's lifespan. So in that case, you're doing something good. But if you have a game that's like, let's say a horror game, you want a different crowd, right? It's just like if I go to a movie, right? They're choosing to do it. So it depends on what you're doing, how long they're doing it, and where they're doing that activity.
I think one more thing about it, though, don't forget we're humans in this process, and there is a parental part of it that's also quite helpful, right? Like, I'm a mom. There's certain movies that even though my kids might be old enough to go see them, I'm not going to let them go see them. So there is an educational piece that starts in the home and moves outward into entertainment, no different than maybe my kids are only allowed to be on their phones or their computers for a certain number of minutes a day, but other families have no problem with their kids sitting in front of the TV for the entire day. So it's a human thing first. Everything else falls on top.
That's a very important point. Thank you very much. Thank you, both of you. Then Lauren Sally, co-founder of Shake and Bake Productions. Thank you. And I would like to thank you as well, Mr. Seth Gerson, CEO of Survios.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Thank you.